Tonight, you're not looking up at an emperor on a balcony. You're sitting close to a radio on a cold New Year's morning, listening to a voice that is about to fold the words, "Living God," into something quieter. Before you fall asleep, you'll hear how a single broadcast loosened a miracle without kicking the throne. How editors behind the curtain laid every noun and verb so Divinity became symbol instead of crisis, and how camera angles, handshakes, and factory gate visits slowly taught a country to see a crown as a person in a suit. Microphones warm with a soft hum. Paper rustles like gentle rain just off mic. Somewhere in the studio, a clock ticks toward 1946 as if it were just another year. The script waits on the desk ink dry, adjectives trimmed, no thunder left in the margins. When the Emperor's voice arrives, it is formal and distant, yet it slides into kitchens and temporary shelters like steam from a kettle. People lean closer, adjust the volume, try not to miss a syllable, and then almost automatically go back to making tea. If nights like this keep you company, you might consider subscribing. And if you share where and what time you're listening from, perhaps the next faint crackle of a radio will remember you there. Half awake while a living God quietly becomes a job title the grammar can live with. You might not think a single radio broadcast delivered in a careful, slightly old-fashioned voice could make a living God quietly become a symbol, but in Japan's first dawn of 1946, that is more or less what happened, without anyone needing to kick the throne over, or even scuff the floor. Let the microphones warn a little, let the paper rustle like soft rain, let the clock tick its polite way toward New Year's morning, and I will never know either way, which is wonderfully low pressure. So picture it. The nation is bruised and tired, the air is cold, the calendar has clicked over, and a sentence is about to be unstitched with the kind of care you use when removing a stitch from an old coat without tearing the fabric underneath. The phrase "living God" had been wrapped around the emperor for decades like a ceremonial robe, heavy, impressive, not always practical, and occasionally tripped over in a hurry, and now the robe needed to be folded differently, not burned. The 1946 rescript that people later nicknamed the Humanity Declaration did not so much slam a door on myth as set the myth down gently on a shelf beside history with a little note that said in effect, "Handle with care, do. Not used as a weapon." The tone mattered as much as the content. It spoke of bonds between ruler and people, of mutual trust, of tradition, of continuing duties. And it shifted the center of gravity from descent from heaven language towards something more domestic and civic. The emperor is a figure defined by relationship, not lightning. It is very hard to take thunder out of a system without startling everyone, so the trick is to lower the volume one knob at a time, like turning down a radio without making it click. And there is also the simple fact that, for many listeners, a voice on the radio feels more intimate than a face on a coin. People heard it in kitchens and temporary shelters, in rooms where the windows were still taped, and they did what humans always do with a radio. They adjusted the volume, they leaned closer, they tried to catch every syllable, and then they went back to making tea, because history often arrives at the same table as breakfast. And that is what makes this moment so strangely powerful. It is a miracle ending by way of grammar. The words did not burst into the room. They drifted in, and by the time the room noticed, the furniture had already been rearranged. If you want a mildly absurd image to hold on to, imagine an entire country watching someone quietly replace the label on a very large, very old filing cabinet. Same cabinet, same place, same imposing drawers, but the label now reads symbol, and everyone agrees not to make a scene about the adhesive. Behind that calm surface, though, there were editors, and not the glamorous kind with scarves and coffee, but the historical kind. Occupation officials, translators, court advisors, bureaucrats who could spend an afternoon deciding whether one noun should lean slightly more modern, and whether a verb could be safely moved a few inches to the left. After 1945, Japan was occupied, and the palace wanted survival as much as dignity, while the occupiers wanted stability as much as reform, and so the script was built like a bridge that could hold weight from both directions. Every clause had to balance. No surrender of dignity, but also no insistence on supernatural right. No sudden humiliation, but also no open invitation to keep worshipping politics. It is the kind of writing you do when your audience includes everyone, including people who are ready to misunderstand you on purpose. Imagine negotiating a terms of service update with 1,000 years of tradition. You can't just hit accept all and move on, because the pop-up is the country itself. So the language becomes careful, almost padded. It offers continuity while quietly turning the hard, sharp metaphysics into softer, safer symbolism. What the nation heard as humility was also policy written in a whisper, and in a whisper you can say things that would sound aggressive if shouted. You can redirect loyalty from aura to labor, from sacred distance to ordinary duty, and you can do it while letting everyone keep their face, which is, in its own sleepy way, a form of national anesthesia. And once words have shifted, photographs can do the rest, because images are like short sentences the mind reads automatically. In the years after surrender, the emperor begins to be seen differently. Less incense, more camera flash. Less throne room, more sunlight. Less brocade, more business suit. You can almost hear the click of a button replacing the ringing of a bell. A suit, a brimmed hat, a small smile trained to land gently, a hand raised at factory gates, a gesture designed to say, I am here, without saying, I am above. Tours move through ruins like slow stitches, tying emperor to citizen with visible thread, and that thread is made of ordinary questions, rice, housing, textbooks, the kinds of words you can say in daylight without invoking heaven. There is something almost comforting in the smallness of it. A man asks about supplies and rebuilding. The questions are practical, the answers are practical, and practicality in a shattered landscape can feel like a lullaby. The camera angle is not an accident either. Faces are framed level, not bowed. Light falls evenly. The composition says human scale, even when the subject is a symbol. If you want another mild modern analogy, it is like watching a company rebrand from mystical founder to trusted institution, complete with new headshots and a friendlier font, except the company is a monarchy and the font is the human face. None of this means the old rituals evaporate. They shrink in quiet. Court rites lose audience and volume, but keep their place in the calendar's bones, because calendars, like sleepy minds, dislike sudden emptiness. Shrines continue, but the public language around them shifts. Culture, heritage, ceremony, rather than pipelines to a divine household. The Constitution recasts the monarch as a symbol of the state and of the unity of the people, which is a sentence that sounds almost like furniture assembly. Instructions, but it matters because it gives the role a new job. To be seen, to be studied, to be repeatable. Old choreography is allowed to breathe in private rooms, behind paper screens, where tradition becomes intimate instead of political. Boundaries become routine rather than spectacle, public service by day, careful ceremony by night. And if that sounds like a person trying to live two lives politely, that is because it is. The hush is strategic. A noisy ritual draws attention. A quiet ritual becomes background, and background is where a symbol can survive without demanding belief minute by minute. Meanwhile, a different kind of rewriting happens in courtrooms and archives, where responsibility is sorted like paperwork that has been dropped in a storm. Prosecutors pursue generals and ministers. TRIL set up tables and labels. The post-war world wants accountability, but it also wants a functioning country, and so the throne is ring-fenced as necessary scaffolding. Not because everyone feels morally satisfied history is rarely that tidy, but because stability has a way of winning arguments simply by preventing new disasters. Immunity becomes a tool, and tools, as you know, can be useful without being beautiful. Blame travels downward and outward. The institution remains in place like a lamp turned to a lower wattage, still on, less blinding, meant to help people find the next step rather than stare at the bulb. Justice and utility share a desk. The file is closed with more caution than celebration. It is the kind of ending that does not feel like an ending at all, which is perfect for bedtime history because true closure would wake you up. And then there's memory, the slow and stubborn kind, the kind that gets taught. School pages begin to replace miracle with metaphor, and heroism with recovery times and crop yields. Lessons drift toward rebuilding. How much rice? How many roofs? How many classrooms? How many trains running again? And in that drift, the extraordinary becomes administrative. Temple visits still happen, but now they can be framed as tradition, as community, as cultural practice headlines and footnotes instead of thunder. Controversy is measured, the calendar remains intact, and pronouns, those small, almost invisible levers shift quietly. Not divine father, not supreme commander, but symbol, a word that asks the role to be. Understandable rather than worshipped. Language changes the air trains the eye makes the role feel normal. Normal is an underrated invention. Normal is what lets a mind relax into a routine and stop scanning the horizon for cosmic messages. If you want a strange little microfact to drift past here, consider how many people can accept enormous change as long as the packaging looks familiar. The same ceremonies on the same dates, the same faces in the same place, but a different explanation printed in smaller letters underneath, like a museum plaque updated for clarity. With time, the crown learns a new way to exist in public. There are balconies with family members, schedules of openings, medals pinned with steady fingers, the kind of gestures that say continuity without demanding myth. Power moves into budgets and cabinets and committees that do not need a god to sign the forms, just someone to appear, to nod, to make the ribbon cutting look official. Reverence cools into etiquette formal, repeatable, easy to teach to children, and children are always the long-term audience. The office survives by becoming smaller, and the smaller shape proves easier to keep, like folding a large cloth into a neat square instead of trying to keep it billowing dramatically in the wind. Somewhere inside that folding, there is a gentle lesson about how institutions endure. They change, but they pretend softly that they have simply always been this way, and most people are happy to accept the story because it lets everyone sleep. Which brings us, in the calmest possible way, to a little bedtime oath for reading Thrones. Not to judge, not to worship, but to observe with a patient eye. Keep facts in one jar speech, tours, constitution, camera angles, and keep legend in another, labeled, light, revisable. When a role changes, watch the verbs before the titles, and watch the photographs before the proclamations, because verbs tell you what a person is allowed to do, and photographs tell you what the public is allowed to feel. And when words get heavy, count your breaths 4 in, 6 out until the weight becomes simply a sensation that passes through you. The microphone cools, the page lies flatter. Outside, a country practices daylight without miracles, and inside, the mind practices letting meaning become quiet, and then quieter, as if the sentence could keep going forever. But it doesn't have to, not urgently, just softly, like a radio left on low in the next room, saying ordinary words while you drift. You might not expect a slippery, unimpressive fish to function as a rent payment, a bookkeeping unit, and a quiet little symbol of civic order, but for quite a long time in parts of medieval England, the eel did exactly that, and it did it without speeches, banners, or even a decent facial expression. If you're listening from somewhere soft and harmless, let that image settle in. A damp riverside morning, a reed bed that looks like it has always been thinking about mud, and a person whose job description is essentially counts eels with a straight face. If you were still awake by the time we reach the point where a town owes thousands of eels like it as a perfectly normal subscription plan, feel free to subscribe. Or don't. The eels will not mind, and neither will the ledgers, because ledgers are famously emotionally restrained. The sleepy part of this story begins in the places where eels actually live, which are the sorts of places that look like the world is half finished. Fens, marshes, slow rivers, and water that can't quite decide whether it wants to be land. In the Middle Ages, that indecision was useful. Waterways were highways before highways, and wetland food was reliable in a way that wheat sometimes wasn't, especially when the sky decided to do a surprise winter. Eels, in particular, were abundant in certain regions, and abundance is the first step toward turning something into currency, or at least into a ritualized obligation. They were also conveniently shaped for counting, in the unsentimental sense that one eel is one eel, and if you put enough of them in a basket, the basket becomes a unit of human planning. There is a comforting dullness to this. You can argue about coins and their purity. You can argue about the king's face on the metal, but an eel is not pretending to be anything other than an eel. It arrives shiny, it looks mildly disappointed to be involved, and it gets you one step closer to paying what you owe. This is where the paperwork creeps in, as it always does, because medieval life was not only mud and monks, it was also lists. One of the great monuments of English administrative energy is the Domesday Book, compiled in 1086, which is essentially a nationwide survey of who held what it produced, and what it was worth. It has the vibe of a giant spreadsheet written by hand, except the cell values include cows, mills, fisheries, and yes, eels. In some entries, the value of a fishery is expressed in numbers of eels it can render as dues, because the government, like a tired parent, wanted predictable outputs. If a manor had a fishery that yielded a certain number of eels for the lord or the crown, that number could be recorded, and expected. It is the kind of system that makes modern people nod with a strange sense of kinship. We have direct debits. They had eel debits. The only major difference is that modern subscriptions do not rive, at least not visibly. Once you accept that eels can be counted, you begin to notice how serious people became about the counting. Some places owed hundreds of eels, others thousands, as routine annual payments. And what sounds bizarre now was then simply a way of converting local resources into a standardized obligation. A fish-rich area could be taxed in fish. A grain-rich area could be taxed in grain. A place with a productive wetland could be taxed in the wetland's most cooperative output. And in a world where preserving food mattered, eels were not only countable but also storable. They could be smoked, dried, salted, or turned into something you might politely call a durable protein product if you were pitching it to a medieval procurement office. The eel becomes a bridge between ecology and governance, which is a fancy way of saying that the king's authority sometimes arrived in the form of a damp basket. It helps for bedtime purposes to imagine the actual work. Catching eels was not glamorous. It involved traps, weirs, nets, and the kind of repetitive patience that makes your thoughts wander into extremely unimportant places, like whether reeds ever get bored of being reeds. Eel traps could sit in shallow water and do their quiet job, and then someone would come along with the trap and discover that the trap had collected a small, wriggling arithmetic problem. The eels would be sorted: large ones, small ones, livelier ones that had the energy of a medieval argument, and then prepared for delivery or preservation. This is where the story becomes gently absurd, because the payment is both real and awkward. Imagine bringing your landlord a bag of fish as rent. Now imagine doing that with official solemnity, as if it were a coin purse. And then imagine the landlord's clerk writing down, in tidy script, that you have provided exactly the required number of slippery obligations, and that the account is now, for the year, satisfied. Delivery, too, had its own quiet choreography. Eels owed as rent might be carried to a manor house, a monastic house, a market center, or a royal official, depending on who was entitled to them. There would be baskets, barrels, sacks, and plenty of smells that no one wrote poetry about. The clerk, meanwhile, would do what clerks do: convert the physical mess into symbols on a page. This is where the eel becomes almost magical in a boring way. A living, wriggling thing becomes a number, and that number becomes a right, and that right becomes a predictable relationship between people who might otherwise argue. The eel is not a romance. It is a contract with fins. The clerk's role is crucial because without the record, the eel payment is just a fish delivery. With the record, it is proof of order. It is the medieval equivalent of payment received, except the receipt might smell faintly like a riverbank. You might wonder why anyone would accept eels instead of something simpler, and the answer is, gently, that simplicity is relative. In an economy where coins existed but were not always plentiful, and where local resources varied sharply, payment in kind was practical. Eels were a form of value that did not require minting. They could feed households, supply feasts, stock kitchens, and support institutions that had many mouths to fill, like monasteries, castles, or urban centers. This was not only about luxury, it was about calories and reliability. The eel was a way to move nutrition through a system that needed nutrition to keep its humans politely functioning. And if you want a small, sleepy irony, consider that eels were both humble and elite. They could be everyday food in eel-rich places, yet also a desirable item in markets further away, where a good eel might be a treat. The same object can be both boring and valuable, and history is full of things like that, including paperwork. The language around these obligations can get wonderfully specific. Medieval documents sometimes distinguish between different kinds of fisheries, different rights to fish, and different dues owed from water resources. There are words that feel like they were invented by someone whose personality was primarily administration, and there are disputes that hinge on who is allowed to place a weir where, or who has the right to take eels from a particular stretch of water. In other words, even the eel had boundaries, and where there are boundaries, there are arguments. But we can keep the arguments gentle today because the point is not drama. The point is the slow realization that behind the grand titles and battles, there was also a soft damp. Economy of routine, where someone's yearly obligation could be measured in fish with secretive faces. Sometimes the numbers themselves are the most soothing part. A fishery might be valued at so many eels per year, and that number becomes a rhythm in local life. Year after year, the eel count returns like a seasonal event. Harvest, winter, spring, eel rent. It's almost comforting to imagine a community that knows, with sleepy certainty, that at a certain time someone will be counting. And because the eel is not negotiable in the way coin might be, the count becomes a kind of ritual. One eel short is one eel short, and you can't argue that your eel was worth more emotionally. The clerk will not accept, but this eel had good intentions. The clerk will accept eels. Over time, of course, these systems shift. Money becomes more widespread, markets expand, and payments in kind often convert into monetary rents or other forms of obligation that are easier to transport and, importantly, easier to keep dry. This does not happen overnight, and when it happens, it tends to leave traces. Records that show a payment once made in eels now commuted into a cash equivalent, as if someone finally admitted that while eels are honest, they are also inconvenient. You can almost picture the administrative side. Someone somewhere probably said something like, "Could we just not do the fish thing?" And then someone else probably said, "Yes." But what is the eel equivalent in pennies? Because even when you modernize with a calculator made of anxiety. The eel also fades for environmental reasons. in the slow way that environments change when humans drain wetlands, alter rivers, and reshape landscapes for agriculture and settlement. The fens are gradually transformed, water is managed more aggressively, and eel-rich ecosystems don't always remain eel-rich. This is not a tragedy with a single moment. It's a drizzle of cause, an effect that spreads across decades and centuries, the sort of change no one can point to in a single bedtime sentence. But the basic consequence is simple enough. If eels become less abundant, they become less convenient as a routine unit of obligation. It's hard to build a tax system on something that refuses to show up in adequate numbers, which is also why modern governments do not accept rent in butterflies. And yet, even as eel rents decline, the idea lingers in that pleasantly pointless way that makes history good for sleep. It lingers as a reminder that economies are not abstract. They are made of whatever people have, wherever they are. It's easy to imagine medieval society as all castles and banners, but the more accurate picture includes baskets, reeds, smokehouses, and a person who smells like river water doing careful arithmetic. It includes monastic kitchens receiving deliveries, scribes making marks, and local officials quietly ensuring the right quantities move along the right channels. It includes the strange satisfaction of a debt being settled with something that was half an hour earlier trying to escape. If you let your mind drift a little further, you can almost feel how this kind of detail softens the sharp edges of history as a concept. The past is not only kings and crusades. It is also the stubborn persistence of routine. It is the fact that someone, at some point, worried about whether the eels were counted correctly, because incorrect eel counting could apparently disrupt social order. It is the knowledge that humans will formalize anything they can measure, and if they can't measure it easily, they will invent a clerk who can. And it is also, quietly, the knowledge that much of what we call civilization is simply the organized movement of boring things, grain, wood, salt, paperwork, and, occasionally, a basket of fish that looks faintly offended to have become a financial instrument. So, as the night continues and your thoughts become less interested in their own sharpness, you can keep one gentle image, a medieval ledger with ink drying slowly, a line that notes a payment received, and the meaning hidden inside that dullness. It is the sound of a system trying to be stable. It is the soft hum of people agreeing year after year to translate nature into obligation and obligation into continuity. Somewhere, water moves under a bridge. Somewhere, a clerk's quill scratches. Somewhere, an eel does what eels do, which is to exist in a way that makes humans inexplicably want to count it. And if you feel your attention slipping, you can let it slip without worry, because the story does not need you to hold it tightly. It can keep drifting on its own, like a slow river, carrying its mildly ridiculous cargo of facts, toward a quieter part of your mind where everything becomes as unurgent as wet reeds in the dark. You might not expect a large wooden ball to be one of the gentlest tools of empire, but for a while in the 19th century, a lot of people set their watches because a ball politely dropped down a pole at exactly the agreed-upon moment, like a slow ceremonial wink from the universe. If you're re-listening from a place where the light is low and the room docent, to need anything from you, you can imagine that ball waiting at the top perfectly still, as if it's trying not to disturb anyone. And if you still awake by the time I start mumbling about railway timetables and the mild personality of station clocks, you can subscribe if you want. Or don't. Time will pass either way with the same calm confidence it has always shown. Before all of this careful standardization, time was, in the most literal sense, local. Noon was when the sun was highest where you happened to be standing, and that meant noon in one town was not quite noon in the next town. The difference might be only a few minutes, sometimes less, but a few minutes are surprisingly powerful when you try to coordinate anything larger than a sleepy walk. For centuries, most people didn't need to coordinate much beyond what the church bell hinted at and what the sky suggested. and the sky is never late in a way that matters socially. The problem arrives when you build railways, because railways are basically long straight lines that drag distant places into the same schedule whether they like it or not. A train does not politely adjust its tempo for each village's opinion about the sun. A train is not easily impressed by your charming local noon. So imagine a world where a person in one town swears it is 10:12, and a person in another town insists it is 10:19, and both of them are correct because they are each loyal to their own patch of sunlight. For a while, that was simply how it was. And if you wanted to travel, you accepted that clocks were more like suggestions pinned to walls. But timetables are not fond of suggestions. A timetable wants clean lines, a single authority, and most importantly, fewer arguments with angry passengers standing on platforms with damp hats. When early railway companies tried to publish schedules, they had to pick a noun that could travel. In Britain, the obvious candidate was Greenwich Mean Time, because Greenwich already had a reputation for serious timekeeping, the kind that helps ships avoid becoming surprised by coastlines. This is where the story becomes wonderfully, sleepily bureaucratic. The decision to use one shared time wasn't always announced with grand speeches. It crept into daily life through printed timetables, station clocks, and the quiet insistence of conductors who preferred not to negotiate with every town sundial. People began to hear phrases like railway time, which sounds like a strong, modern idea until you realize it is essentially a polite request to agree on what the minute hand is doing. Many towns eventually aligned their public clocks with the railway's clocks, partly because it was convenient, and partly because it was embarrassing to have your town's main clock publicly disagree with the station. There is a specific kind of humiliation in being corrected by a train schedule, and you can picture the gradualness of the change. Some places would keep local time on a church clock while the station ran on railway time, so you could stand in one small town and see two different truths in the same street. That is a charming way to live if you enjoy philosophical confusion, but it is less charming if you have a ticket that says 205 and you are not sure which 205 it means. Eventually, the practical pressure wins, because practicality is one of history's most reliable, least dramatic characters. Nobody writes epics about practicality, and yet it keeps showing up, tugging the story forward by the sleeve. To make a single time authoritative, you also need a way to distribute it, and that is where technology enters in a very quiet, unromantic way. The telegraph, which is sometimes described as revolutionary, also functioned as a kind of long-distance whisper that carried the time signal from one place to another. Once you can transmit a precise signal across distances, you can synchronize clocks, which is the polite version of telling every clock in the country to stop freelancing. The idea is simple. Somewhere you decide what time it is. Everywhere else you listen. It's not that different from modern devices checking a network time server, except in the 19th century, the network had human operators, and the server sometimes involved an observatory and a person staring at the sky with solemn competence. Now, about that ball. At Greenwich, one of the practical problems was helping ships in the Thames and beyond set their marine chronometers accurately. Chronometers mattered because knowing the time precisely, especially the difference between local time and a reference time, helped navigators calculate longitude. Again, it sounds lofty until you remember the practical outcome. Fewer ships accidentally arriving in the wrong place with a confused crew and a strong smell of damp rope. A visible signal, like a large ball dropping at a known moment, was an elegant solution because you didn't need to hear it. You could simply see it. A ball raised up the mast and then released at a precise time gives a clear, sudden event that can be matched to a watch. And there is something almost hypnotic about the idea. Dozens of people on ships quietly watching for the same motion, then glancing down, then making tiny adjustments with the seriousness of someone tuning an instrument. If you want to feel how boring and grand this is at the same time, imagine a sailor on a cold day, holding a chronometer like it's a small, expensive sleeping animal eyes flicking between the horizon and the ball. He is not thinking about metaphysics. He is thinking, when the ball drops, I will do a small action quickly. That small action, repeated by many people, is how a shared sense of time becomes real in practice. The universe is vast, but the human relationship with it can be distilled into the handling of a watch that smells faintly of oil. Time balls weren't only at Greenwich. Other ports adopted similar visual signals. The concept spreads because it is useful, and usefulness spreads with all the quiet confidence of a good tool. There's also something satisfying about a signal that is both dramatic and completely unexciting. A ball drops. That is the whole show. The audience applauds internally by not crashing their ship later. Sometimes the ball would be raised gradually before the drop, which means the signal had a pre-signal like a little invitation to pay attention. It's almost polite. Hello, says the ball, slowly ascending. In a moment, says the ball, at the top. And then now, says the ball, by falling. On land, the spread of standard time had its own small theater. Station masters became accidental time authorities, which is a strange social role if you think about it. Imagine being the person in town who tells everyone, by implication, what now is. You don't wear a crown. You have paperwork. You probably have keys. You might also have a pocket watch that you treat like a sacred object, except you would never call it sacred out loud because you are busy being practical. Whoever controlled the station clock controlled the day's rhythm. Departures, arrivals, connections, the little panics of people running with their bags. If you've ever been late for something, you already know that minutes have emotional weight, even if we pretend they are neutral. Clocks themselves also had to evolve, not in the poetic sense, but in the please stay consistent sense. Public clocks needed to be accurate enough that they didn't wander off into their own ideas. Watchmakers and clockmakers developed reputations not just for artistry, but for reliability, which is the most boring compliment you can give a craftsperson and also the highest. Some clocks became synchronized by signal, others were corrected manually, and some were simply judged by the station's time. There is a nice irony here. The grand movement toward modernity sometimes depended on a man walking up to a clock with a key and deciding it was time to be right. Of course, people did not immediately stop caring about the sun. The sun was persuasive. For a while, there was a sort of cultural double vision. Official time was one thing, local experience was another, and people adjusted in the way humans always adjust. Partially, unevenly, with small pockets of resistance and a lot of shrugging. But schedules win social space. Shops open when people think they should open. Work starts when the factory whistle says it starts. And eventually, time becomes less about the sky and more about agreement. It's a quiet social contract signed without ink. You just show up when the clock says, and you pretend that this is perfectly natural, even though for most of human history it would have sounded like a slightly obsessive hobby. If you drift across the Atlantic, the same problem shows up on a larger scale. In the United States, local times between cities could differ by minutes that become inconvenient over long distances. And by the late 19th century, railroads had a very strong incentive to stop letting every town have its own noon. The railroads began moving towards standardized time, and in 1883, there's the famous moment when many American railroads adopted a system of standard time zones. It's sometimes called the Day of Two Noons, because some places effectively reset their clocks to match the new scheme. That sounds dramatic, but most people probably experienced it as mild confusion followed by lunch. Standard time arrives not with a trumpet, but with a slightly altered wall clock, and a person saying, "Yes, it's this now." And this is the part that always feels a little funny in a sleepy way. We talk about time zones as if they are natural features, like mountains, but they are a human invention. They are lines drawn by agreement, and agreement is one of the most fragile and powerful tools humans have. The earth spins, yes, but the decision to label certain spinning moments as 3 p.m. is a social decision dressed as a fact. If that thought feels too awake, you can let it go. The point is not existential dread. The point is that people with timetables needed the world to behave politely, and the world, through paperwork and habit, obliged. Back in Britain, the presence of Greenwich as a reference point became increasingly normal. You could say the country gradually learned to think in Greenwich, which is an odd way to describe a national mental habit, but it's accurate enough. Time signals could be sent out, clocks could be set, and the cultural weight of agreement grew. The time ball at Greenwich, dropping day after day, became a ritual of precision. It's a ritual without chanting, which might be the best kind for sleep. No one needs to feel inspired. Everyone just needs to be accurate enough. There were, of course, little imperfections because history is allergic to perfection. Weather could obscure visible signals. Equipment could fail. A clock could be wrong. Someone could forget to correct it until an entire small town had been confidently living 10 minutes in the past, which is a very calm alternative to living in the future. But the system's strength was that it didn't require everyone to be perfect all the time. It required that enough people agree often enough, and daily repetition helps. When a signal happens every day, you can miss it today and catch it tomorrow. Civilization, at its gentlest, is just a series of "we'll try again in the morning" arrangements. If you think about it long enough, the time ball is also a kind of public performance of trust. You trust that the people at the observatory know what they're doing. You trust that the signal is correct. You trust that your own watch is capable of being corrected. And then you trust that everyone else is also doing roughly the same thing, so that a meeting at 2 actually means the same 2 for both of you. It is wildly cooperative. It is also completely unglamorous. It is the kind of cooperation that makes society possible, and because it is unglamorous, it is rarely celebrated, which makes it perfect bedtime material. So you can let your mind wander through the small scenes this creates. A dockside figure watching for the drop, a station master checking a clock, a clerk writing down a time, a watchmaker adjusting a gear, a commuter glancing up at a station clock and feeling briefly reassured. You can feel, in all of this, a slow drift away from the sun's authority and toward the authority of shared systems. Not because anyone hates the sun, but because the train does not wait for the sun to be persuasive. The train wants consistency. The ledger wants consistency. The commuter wants consistency. And the wooden ball, in its quiet way, offers consistency as a daily little gesture. And if you start to feel your thoughts fading, if the words Greenwich Mean Time begin to sound like a soft blanket rather than a concept, you can let that happen. The story doesn't need a climax. It doesn't need a moral. The ball drops, the clocks align, the minutes become domesticated, and the whole world slowly learns to agree on what now means. Not perfectly, not forever, but well enough to keep the trains moving and the appointments mostly intact. Somewhere, a clock is being corrected by a hand that knows the routine. Somewhere, a timetable is being read by someone who believes it. Somewhere, a wooden ball is waiting at the top of its pole, patient and quiet, prepared to fall in exactly the way it has fallen before, while the room you're in stays still and kind, and time, having been made boring and reliable, does what it does best. It continues, softly, without asking you to watch it. You might not expect the fate of a kilogram to involve a quiet vault, a handful of keys, and a kind of polite long-term suspicion that dust might be plotting something. But for more than a century, the world, as most famous mass, was basically a small metal cylinder living a very sheltered life near Paris. like an elderly aristocrat who doesn't enjoy drafts. If you're listening from somewhere dim and soft, you can picture it now, not dramatic, not glowing, not humming with destiny, just sitting there, unimaginably important and deeply uninterested in being looked at, which is a relatable combination. And if you still awake by the time I start talking about bell jars and the emotional atmosphere of a laboratory hallway, feel free to subscribe, or don't. The kilogram will remain exactly as it is, within its glass, refusing to be impressed either way. For a long time, humans measured things the way humans do most things, locally, approximately, and with a confidence that was not always supported by reality. A pound could be a different pound depending on where you were standing, and a foot might be based on a specific person's foot, which is charming until you remember that people's feet vary widely, and also that some people have suspiciously convenient feet. Trade wrinkles when measures wrinkle. Taxes get complicated. Engineering, when it arrives with its blueprints and its desire for repeatability, becomes quietly furious at the idea that a unit of mass might be a regional mood. So by the 19th century, there is this steady, sane ambition to make measurement boring and consistent, so boring that nobody argues about it at dinner. That is the dream, a world in which a kilogram is not a negotiation. The solution, in the era before you can define everything elegantly in terms of fundamental constants and equations that look like they were designed by very tidy angels, is to make a physical object and declare, with a straight face, that this object is the unit. Not an approximation, not a helpful example, but the thing itself. The kilogram in this older arrangement becomes a specific artifact, a carefully made cylinder of platinum iridium alloy, chosen because it's stable, dense, and less inclined to react with the world in messy ways. It is, in other words, a metal with good manners. This cylinder is stored at the International Bureau of Weights and Measures BIP at Sèvres, not far from Paris, in conditions that signal, we do not trust the atmosphere, and the cylinder is treated with the kind of respect usually reserved for royal jewels or awkward family heirlooms. You keep it safe, you don't touch it casually, and you definitely do not let someone wander in with jam on their fingers. Even the way it is stored sounds like something a very careful person would invent after noticing that the universe contains dust. The kilogram is typically kept under bell jars, like a tiny museum exhibit for a single item, except the item is a unit, and the museum is a laboratory, and the audience is basically nobody. Sometimes there are multiple layers of protection, which gives the whole arrangement an almost fairy tale quality, except the fairy tale is about preventing fingerprints. The cylinder sits in a controlled environment, and access is constrained not only by walls and doors, but by procedure, which is the laboratory equivalent of a lock. Procedure is a lock made of paperwork and tradition. It is remarkably effective because nobody wants to be the person who broke the kilogram rules. You can break many things and still recover socially, but breaking the kilogram rules is the sort of mistake that follows you into silence. There is a gentle absurdity here that can help you relax. The world's mass standard is an object that can, in theory, change. Not because it wants to, but because physical objects have the audacity to exist in a physical world. They can accumulate contamination. They can lose tiny amounts of material in handling, even careful handling. They can interact with their environment in microscopic ways, and when the object is the definition, even microscopic changes become philosophical. It is like defining 1 minute as the lifetime of a particular candle flame, and then realizing that candle flames are, unfortunately, moody. So people became extremely serious about not letting anything happen. They treated the kilogram as though time itself might try to steal a few atoms while nobody was watching, which, to be fair, is exactly what time does. It just does it quietly. And this is where the story gets pleasantly, sleepily bureaucratic, because you don't just make 1 kilogram and then let the whole planet share it by imagination. You make copies, official copies, carefully calibrated duplicates that can be sent to different countries so that everyone can align their measurement systems. These copies are compared against the original, and those comparisons are treated with great seriousness, like a family reunion where everyone is quietly checking whether anyone has changed too much. Over time, you discover an awkward truth. When you compare the original to the copies and to each other, tiny differences can appear, and you can't always easily tell who drifted. Was it the original? Was it a copy? Was it the cleaning method? Was it the universe's subtle sense of humor? The numbers are tiny micrograms, the sort of amount nobody cares about when they are baking a cake. And yet it matters enormously when measurement is the foundation for science and industry. It's the most boring form of drama imaginable, which makes it perfect. To manage this, the kilogram's life includes rare ceremonial moments of being handled, not often, not casually. When it's time for comparison, trained people prepare, and the process becomes almost ritual. The object is removed carefully, weighed against other standards using extremely sensitive balances, and then returned to its quiet existence. If you enjoy imagining the emotional ambience of a lab, you can picture a room that is silent in the particular way that serious rooms are silent, where even breathing feels like a loud opinion. People might wear gloves, use tools, avoid unnecessary movement, and communicate with the calm focus of someone trying not to scare a shy animal. The animal, in this case, is a cylinder of metal. It does not run away, but in a sense it does, because any careless touch can introduce oils or dust, and oils and dust are tiny, and tiny is where the whole meaning lives. Cleaning, too, is a small story inside the story. When you have an object whose surface condition matters, cleaning becomes a highly controlled act, as if you're grooming a unit of mass the way you'd groom a show dog. There are careful methods, specific materials, routines that aim to remove contamination without removing the object itself. You want cleanliness without abrasion. You want purity without loss. You want to do something to the artifact while insisting nothing about it truly changes, which is the kind of contradiction humans are oddly comfortable maintaining. And cleaning can alter the mass by a minute amount, which is both reasonable and also a little existential. Imagine scrubbing a pan and accidentally making the definition of 1 kilogram slightly different. It's not the kind of power most people seek, and yet it exists in a quiet room under glass. What makes all of this even more soothing is the contrast between how grand measurement sounds and how domestic its protection can be. We talk about international standards, scientific certainty, global coordination, and then the physical reality is a small cylinder under a bell jar in a vault, guarded by protocol. It's like discovering that the stability of modern civilization depends partly on someone remembering where they put the keys, and not placing a sandwich too close to the balance room. There is something comforting about that because it means history is not only about great forces, it is also about careful habits. It is about people deciding that boredom and consistency are virtues worth maintaining. If you drift a little through the 19th and 20th centuries, you can feel how these standards insinuate themselves into daily life. Factories calibrate equipment, laboratories compare results. Pharmacies rely on accurate mass for dosages and mixtures. Engineers build structures that require predictable materials. Even the most ordinary objects, bags of flour, postage, coinage benefit from the idea that a kilogram or a gram means the same thing in different places. The kilogram in its vault is the quiet ancestor of every scale that doesn't lie too much. And scales, when they do lie, tend to lie because they are poorly calibrated, which is the polite way of saying they have drifted away from the ancestor and are living their own little rebellious life. Most rebellion is loud. Scale rebellion is silent and mildly inconvenient. The longer this continues, the more the limitations begin to itches of scientific patience. Because if your standard is a physical object, you're one accident away from having a very interesting problem. You could lose it. It could be damaged. It could change. And then you would be defining mass by a missing object, which is not ideal. So over time, metrologists, the people who care deeply about measurement, with the calm intensity of librarians who have been asked to store a lightning, start seeking definitions that don't rely on a particular artifact. They want to define things in a way that can be recreated anywhere, in principle, by experiments and constants, rather than by pilgrimage to a vault. The dream is that a kilogram becomes a relationship in nature rather than a cylinder under glass. This is a very soothing ambition because it is essentially the desire to make measurement immune to fingerprints. But even as the definitions evolve in the modern era, the story of the old artifact remains oddly charming. There is something about the physicality of it, the idea that for decades the world agreed that this exact thing, this exact cylinder, was mass itself. It feels like a relic, except the religion is precision. It feels like a sacred object, except the prayers are performed with bounces and controlled humidity. And it also feels slightly funny, because what it really is, after all the solemnity, is an unassuming piece of metal that did not ask to be famous. If you let your mind wander further, you can imagine the average day in the building where such an object is kept. Most days, nothing happens. That is the point. The kilogram rests. The bell jar remains undisturbed. The vault is quiet. People do their work elsewhere, calibration, analysis, comparisons of other standards, documentation, while the kilogram simply exists, like a sleeping cat that everyone agrees not to move. The greatest compliment you can pay the system is that it is boring. No news is good news. No handling is ideal handling. The unit is stable, and stability is the soft pillow underneath the loud world. There are also the human details that keep this entire edifice gently grounded. Committees meet. International agreements are written and revised. Reports are produced with careful language that avoids unnecessary excitement, because metrology is not a field that benefits from exclamation points. People argue politely about uncertainty and error margins, which is a kind of conflict where the weapons are decimal places. Imagine two very calm adults disagreeing about the last digit in a measurement, and the last digit being important enough to justify a meeting. That is, in a way, the height of civilization. Disagreement that does not break anything, expressed in mathematics, conducted in rooms with good lighting. And if you want a soft microhook to keep you drifting, consider this. The most important measurements in the world often depend on the least dramatic objects. A clock can change history. A standard can enable technology. A cylinder can anchor economies. None of these things feel like heroes. They feel like stationary. And perhaps that is the best kind of hero for falling asleep to. The hero who does nothing loudly, who simply stays consistent while the rest of the world spins and sweats and improvises. You can also think about how deeply psychological standards are. They are agreements. They rely on trust. They rely on shared procedures. They rely on the fact that people in distant places will accept that a body in Severs or a definition in a document has authority. This trust is so normal now that it becomes invisible, which is another way of saying it becomes comfortable. When you buy something by weight, you are participating in a long chain of agreements and calibrations that lead, historically, to the quiet cylinder under glass. And you do it without thinking, which is the ultimate success of a system. It becomes background. So, in the half-light of a bedtime mood, you can let the image soften into something simple. A small vault with a quiet object inside. A bell jar like a transparent umbrella. A metal cylinder that once carried the whole world's 1 kilogram on its shoulders, without shoulders, and without complaint. You can let the seriousness of it become gentle. You can let the idea of people protecting a unit from dust become faintly funny, like guarding the concept of one from getting smudged. And then you can let it fade further, because the story doesn't need to end. It can keep humming quietly, careful hands, sensitive balances, tiny differences, slow procedures, international calm. Somewhere, a measurement is being traced back through links and documents and calibrations. Somewhere, a scale is being adjusted to behave. Somewhere, a laboratory wall clock ticks with the confidence of being synchronized. And somewhere, under glass, a small object continues its most important job, which is not to do anything at all, and not to change, and to remain, night after night, as boring and dependable as a soft, steady breath. You might not expect a two-syllable word pronounced in a tired mouth. A bit like a sigh to become a useful piece of plumbing for an empire, but okay, managed to do exactly that. Slipping quietly from 19th century ink and jokes into telegraphs, offices, and eventually the soft background noise of daily speech. If you're listening from somewhere calm, you can let the letters sit in your mind like two small stones in a pocket, smooth, ordinary, oddly reassuring. And if you're still awake by the time we reach the point where bureaucrats start treating okay like a tiny stamp of approval that saves them 3 sentences, feel free to subscribe. Or don't. Okay does not demand enthusiasm. It is by nature satisfied with adequacy. The story begins in a place that is deeply unromantic, which makes it perfect for sleep, paperwork. Before okay became a universal nod, the world still needed ways to say, yes, received, all correct, no issues, please stop asking me follow-up questions. In the early 19th century, American newspapers and offices were full of little shorthand habits, abbreviations, and playful spellings that drifted through the culture like lint. People sometimes enjoy inventing small codes for each other, especially when writing by hand is time-consuming and the day is already too long. In the 1830s, there was a brief, slightly silly fashion in some circles for making deliberate misspellings and then abbreviating them, as if language itself were taking a lazy nap. All correct could be jokingly written as all correct, and then, because humans love to turn jokes into tools, the initials OK appeared. It is one of those historical moments where the future is built out of a small wink dot at first. This kind of thing would have lived and died as a newspaper fad, the way many little linguistic trends do. But OK had an unusual advantage. It was short, it was easy to write, it was easy to say, and it filled a practical niche. It's not merely a word, it's a function. It means this is acceptable, but also I acknowledge you, but also we can proceed. But also, quietly, I am too tired to add more detail. Those are powerful meanings to pack into 2 characters. And because it can be used without emotion, it works in almost any context. You can say, okay, happily, sadly, lazily, professionally, vaguely, in a whisper and a nod, and it still does its small job. It's the perfect bureaucratic pillow, flat, reliable, not overly decorative. This is where politics wanders in, not with drama, but with a campaign button. During the 1840 U.S. presidential election, Merton Van Buren, who had been born in Kinderhook, New York, picked up a nickname, Old Kinderhook. His supporters used OK and slogans and club names, and suddenly the letters were not only a joke, but also a public emblem. This is one of history's strange tricks. A playful abbreviation becomes a political brand, and a political brand, by being printed everywhere, becomes familiar. Familiar is the first step toward normal. People saw OK on signs, in print, and references. And even if they didn't love Van Buren, they were forced to notice the letters. It's like a small advertising campaign for the concept of agreement dot, of course. Political branding alone does not make a word immortal. What makes it stick is repetition and daily work, and here is where the long, sleepy corridor of administration does its gentle magic. As the 19th century progressed, the United States grew in paperwork and distance. Business expanded. Documents traveled. Decisions needed to be marked, approved, checked, filed, forwarded, acknowledged. In a world built increasingly on written communication, any small shortcut that saves time becomes attractive. Okay begins to appear as a mark on documents, an annotation that means the item is acceptable. The math checks out, the shipment arrived. The account balances, the situation is, in the grandest possible sense, not a problem. A clerk can write okay and move on, which is, at its core, a way of keeping the coffee from going cold. The telegraph makes this even more obvious. Telegraph messages cost money by length, and more importantly, they cost attention by length. When you transmit information as taps or signals, compactness is kindness. A short, clear acknowledgement becomes valuable. Okay becomes a neat little response that can travel quickly and be understood without confusion. It's the perfect telegraphic nod. Imagine someone in an office listening to the tapping, then sending back 2 letters that say, essentially, yes, I received this. No, you do not need to send it again. Please continue. There is something soothing about the economy of it. Entire relationships between offices can be maintained through tiny confirmations. Eventually, okay crosses oceans and languages, not because it is poetic, but because it is easy. It is hard to translate okay perfectly, because its meaning is a cloud of gentle acceptability rather than a single sharp point. Yet many languages adopt it anyway, because the sound is simple and the function is useful. It becomes a loan word and, in some places, a gesture. It sits alongside local words for yes and fine and agreed. And still it persists because it is compact and emotionally non-invasive. If you say okay, you are not promising joy, you are not promising romance, you are not promising revelation. You are promising that things are not actively falling apart. That's enough for most systems. It's enough for most people too, especially late at night. And if you want that mild absurdity that keeps attention gently engaged, consider how okay fits almost everywhere. You can use it in medical charts, in restaurant orders, in military messages, in parenting, in friendship, in bureaucracy, in text messages sent from bed. It can be a full sentence, which is an impressive achievement for 2 letters. It can also be a verdict. You can imagine a stack of papers, each with a tiny okay mark, and each mark representing a small moment of human judgment. The mark says, I looked at this briefly and I have decided not to worry. That is a very calming power, and perhaps that's why people like the word. It's a little permission slip to stop thinking now, because history can't resist adding extra layers to simple things. Okay also accumulates alternative explanations over time. Like a word growing mist the way a stone grows moss. People love to invent backstories, that it comes from a foreign phrase, or a particular military term, or a Scottish expression, or something carved on a barrel. Some of these stories are charming and some are probably wrong, but the existence of the myths is itself comforting. It shows how humans behave when they encounter something common and oddly mysterious. If a word is everywhere, people assume it must have a dramatic origin. But often the origin is just people being people, a joke, a fad, a practical habit. The world is built from small laziness as much as from grand planning in offices. Okay becomes part of a larger ecosystem of stamps and marks. Documents pass through hands, and hands leave signs. Approval stamps, initials, check marks, little arrows, marginal notes that exist for no reason except to make sure someone else doesn't have to ask a question later. Okay is one of the simplest of these marks. It doesn't say your work is brilliant. It doesn't say the plan is inspired. It says the plan is acceptable and can proceed, and that in large systems is what keeps things moving, If everything had to be excellent before moving forward, nothing would ever move. Okay is the quiet lubricant of progress. It's like the hum of a refrigerator, uncelebrated, essential, and only noticed when it stops. If you want a soft, modern analogy that stays gentle, you can think of okay as the original status indicator. It's the green light. It's the scene check mark. It's the little notification that tells you the message reached the other side. In the 19th century, it was ink and paper. In the 20th century, it was voice and wiring. In the 21st, it's a tiny bubble on a screen. But the human need is the same, to know that the world has acknowledged you without requiring an essay in return. Okay, is the promise that the exchange can remain small. There's also a social aspect that makes okay feel like it belongs to bedtime. It is a softening word. It avoids confrontation. It avoids intensity. It can be used to accept things, to conclude things, to pause things, to end a conversation without slamming a door. Sometimes it can be passive-aggressive, yes, but we don't need that version tonight. Tonight, we can keep the neutral version, the version that means fine, in the most gentle, non-dramatic sense. The version that lets you stop circling a thought, the version that sounds like someone patting the air and saying, "It's all right. Leave it." And when you consider the long arc of empire and global trade, okay becomes a tiny piece of shared operational language. 2 letters shared across borders, used in factories and ports and offices, often by people who don't share much else. In that way, it's a little like standard time or standard measurement, a small agreement that helps large systems run. Except it's not a unit, it's a mood. A global mood of this will do. And this will do is, quietly, one of the most important phrases for keeping the world from exhausting itself. So you can let the history of okay drift in your mind like a faint tapping sound telegraph keys. Typewriter keys, keyboard keys, all of them turning human intention into marks. A newspaper joke becomes a campaign slogan. A campaign slogan becomes familiar. Familiar becomes routine. Routine becomes global. And somewhere in a dim office, a clerk puts okay in the margin and moves on to the next page. And the next page, and the next page, while the world beyond the window remains busy and complicated and emotionally loud. Inside the paperwork, though, there's only the quiet satisfaction of acceptance. As your attention softens, you don't need to hold on to every detail. You can keep just 2 letters and the gentle oddness that they traveled so far without demanding much from anyone. Okay doesn't ask you to feel strongly. It doesn't ask you to remember a date. It doesn't ask you to admire anything. It simply confirms that the message got through, that the plan can proceed, that nothing is urgently on fire. And for bedtime history, that is almost the perfect conclusion, except we won't conclude. We'll just let it fade. Somewhere, someone is still writing okay in a corner form. Somewhere, a message is still being acknowledged. Somewhere, a tired mind is still choosing the smallest possible response and finding, in that smallness, a kind of peace. You might not expect a wall label, one small rectangle of paper glued to a jar, to have taken part in imperial logistics, medical anxieties, and the slow global career of sugar. But there was a time when the word treacle sat on shelves like a sleepy, sticky diplomat, pretending to be purely domestic while quietly traveling through trade routes and pharmacies. If you're listening from somewhere dim and calm, you can imagine an old apothecary shop where everything smells faintly of herbs and varnished wood. And somewhere in the back there's a jar of something dark and glossy that nobody can quite define without starting an argument about vocabulary. And if you're still awake by the time I begin describing the personality of syrup, yes, syrup does have a personality. Mostly patient, feel free to subscribe. Or don't. Treacle will continue to ooze through history at its own pace, which is never hurried. The story begins with the fact that words like liquids flow. Treacle originally had a much wider meaning than the comforting British idea of a thick, sweet syrup. The older word comes from ideas of antidotes and medicinal mixtures, and in medieval and early modern Europe, there was a class of preparations sometimes called theriac or treacle, which were not desserts but medicines. They were complex compounds, sometimes involving many ingredients, sometimes built around resins, spices, herbs, and other substances that sounded expensive and reassuring. People liked compound medicines because a long ingredient list looks like effort, and effort looks like care. If you have ever bought a product because the label had many confident words, you already understand the psychology. In a world where disease could arrive like a rumor and stay like a tenant, anything that promised an antidote felt like a small miracle, even if it behaved more like an expensive habit. These medicinal treacles were often associated with protection against poisons and plagues, which is a very dramatic job for something that, in practice, might be a sticky paste. They were related to the legend of ancient antidotes, to the idea that if you combined enough useful substances, you could create a universal defense. It's not entirely nonsensical as a dream. Modern medicine does combine substances in careful ways, but the older versions were not always careful in the modern sense. They were careful in the theatrical sense. The preparation could be elaborate, the mixing could be ceremonious, and the product could be stored in jars that looked important. If you imagine a medieval apothecary, you can picture a shelf where the jar of treacle sits like a senior official. Dark, heavy, and vaguely expensive. The sort of jar a person would trust simply because it looks as though it has been trusted for a long time as time drifts forward. The meaning of treacle begins to slide. The medicinal idea doesn't vanish, but the word starts to get used for thick, sweet syrups too, especially as sugar becomes increasingly available and as syrupy byproducts become part of everyday life. This is where global trade enters quietly, because sugar is never just sugar. Sugar is plantations, shipping, refining, taxation, and the polite fiction that sweetness is an innocent pleasure. In the Caribbean and elsewhere, sugar production generates molasses and other syrup stents, slow liquids that contain the darker, more mineral notes of the process. In Britain, treacle comes to refer to certain kinds of syrup, including what some people mean by molasses, and later what can specifically mean golden syrup, depending on period and context. It's a word that refuses to hold still, which is fitting for something that is always trying to creep dot. This makes treacle a perfect bedtime topic because it sits at the intersection of things that are both ordinary and oddly complicated. In a kitchen, treacle is just a jar you open with mild struggle. In history, treacle is a reminder of how languages drift, how trade changes diets, and how people redefine medicine when their cupboards expand. It's also a reminder that many foods have medical careers before they settle into dessert roles. Sugar itself was once treated as medicinal. Spices were once more pharmacy than flavor. In an older worldview, the boundary between a remedy and a treat was often just the tone of voice you used while describing it, and people did love describing. Apothecaries and physicians in earlier centuries enjoyed categorizing substances: warming, cooling, drying, moistening qualities that sound like weather but were applied to bodies. A thick, dark syrup could be considered nourishing, soothing, helpful for certain complaints, useful for the throat, calming for coughs, or simply reassuring because it was thick and sweet. There's a mild irony here. When you don't have antibiotics, a spoonful of something comforting can become a form of care. It might not cure much, but it aligns your feelings with the idea of being treated, and that matters more than we like to admit. A sticky syrup can be a kind of ritual. The ritual says, we're doing something, and the body, being a cooperative creature when comfort is offered, often relaxes a little. Asterisk, as treacle becomes more food-like, it also becomes more industrial. By the 19th century, Britain's sugar industry produces syrups that can be refined and marketed. Golden syrup, in particular, becomes notable lighter, smoother, and sold with labels that are surprisingly memorable. If you've ever seen an old tin with a lion and bees, you've seen the way marketing can turn syrup into a symbol. And this is another sleepy micro hook. The packaging matters because it's how an industrial product becomes home. A tin on a shelf becomes part of a family's routine. Routine becomes tradition. Tradition becomes nostalgia. Nostalgia becomes the warm feeling you get when you smell something familiar, like syrup and baking, even if you aren't sure why your brain is suddenly thinking about old kitchens. Of course, treacle is also the kind of ingredient that invites unnecessary specificity, which is ideal right now. You can have dark treacle, which is thicker and deeper, and you can have golden syrup, which is lighter and more straightforward, and you can have molasses, which sits somewhere in the same family but with regional naming habits that can provoke gentle confusion. You can have recipes that insist on one and tolerate another with mild disappointment. You can have bakers who treat the differences like personality traits. Dark treacle is brooding. Golden syrup is sociable. Molasses is the cousin who shows up with a story that takes a while. None of this is scientific, but it's emotionally accurate in the way kitchen logic often is. Treacle also behaves in a way that lends itself to sleepy description. It moves slowly. It resists hurrying. It clings. It stretches. It is, in short, a liquid that acts like it has obligations. When you pour treacle, you learn patience. When you measure treacle, you learn that clean measurements are an optimistic fantasy. Measuring treacle is like trying to negotiate with gravity while it's wearing gloves. It gets on spoons, on fingertips, on the rim of the jar, on your thoughts. And because it's sweet and sticky, it is associated with comfort, but also with mildness. That mild mess is part of its charm. There is something honest about an ingredient that refuses to pretend it's tidy dot in older times. That stickiness also had practical uses beyond eating. Syrups can preserve. Sugar can stabilize. Thick, sweet substances can carry flavors and mask less pleasant tastes, which is very useful if you're trying to convince someone to swallow a remedy. This circles us back to the medicinal origin in a quiet way. A pharmacy might use syrup not because syrup is magical, but because syrup makes other things tolerable. If you want a modern analogy, think of it as the original flavoring agent for compliance. A spoonful of sweet helps the rest go down. That line is often quoted with a wink, but it describes a real strategy, comfort as delivery system, and because treacle becomes embedded in everyday life. It also appears in language as metaphor. Treacly comes to mean overly sentimental, overly sweet in tone, so sweet it becomes cloying, like a speech that feels sticky rather than sincere. That metaphor works because everyone who has handled syrup understands stickiness. It's not really sweet, it's sweet that won't let go. You can almost feel the word on your fingers. And once a food becomes a metaphor, it's truly part of culture. It has graduated from pantry to language, which is the highest honor you can pay a jar. Somewhere inside this history, there are also quiet economic and moral shadows, because sugar is rarely innocent. The sweetness that reached British tables was tied to plantations and forced labor in many contexts, and the cheapness of sugar over time was built on systems that were not sweet at all. But we can hold that knowledge gently, without drama, because the aim tonight is not to jolt you awake. It's simply to acknowledge that even a sleepy jar on a shelf can be connected to the world's larger currents. It's the same with many ordinary things: tea, cotton, spices, soap. The mundane carries the weight of the global. and yet the mundane still feels mundane in your hand. That contradiction is one of history's quietest truths. If you drift back into that apothecary scene again, you can imagine the shelves slowly changing over centuries. The early jars labeled with Latin and Greek-sounding names. The later tins printed with confident branding. The shift from "this may protect you from poison" to "this will make gingerbread taste right." It's a gentle descent from drama into domesticity. And domesticity is where a lot of real life happens. In kitchens, treacle becomes part of recipes that repeat. Sticky puddings, ginger cakes, biscuits, sauces. The repetition is soothing. You can almost hear the slow stirring, the spoon dragging through something thick, the scrape of a bowl. Treacle participates by being slow. It refuses to splash like a thin liquid. It chooses instead to stretch and settle, and because it is slow, it creates time. It forces you to pause. You can't rush treacle without making a mess, and a mess is inconvenient. And inconvenience is how the ingredient teaches you to stop. That's a lovely bedtime lesson disguised as cooking. A spoonful takes a moment. The moment becomes a tiny ritual. The ritual becomes calm. Calm becomes sleep. History does not need to be thrilling to be useful. Sometimes it just needs to be viscous dot so you can let the word treacle drift around your mind, carrying its old medicinal shadow and its later kitchen warmth. A word that once meant antidote becomes a syrup that helps biscuits behave. A jar in a shop becomes a tin in a cupboard. A sticky substance becomes a metaphor for speech that is too sweet. And through all of it, treacle remains what it physically is. Slow, dark or golden, heavy, patient, faintly absurd in the way it clings to everything. Somewhere someone is still trying to pour it neatly and failing gently, which is a very human scene. Somewhere a label is still being read. Somewhere a spoon is still being licked clean because syrup inspires that kind of practicality. And as the night continues and your thoughts soften, you don't have to hold any of it tightly. You can let it ooze past, slow and reassuring, like a quiet stream of unnecessary detail, until the details blur into the simple comfort of knowing that even the most boring objects have long histories. And even the longest histories can be carried quietly in a single jar on a shelf. You might not expect a single piece of standardized paper to have the emotional energy of a gentle sigh, but the international reply coupon, an oddly polite invention spent decades quietly helping strangers say, "Please write back," without forcing anyone to perform the awkward international dance of finding the correct stamps in the correct country. If you're listening from somewhere still and dim, you can imagine the coupon itself, a small official rectangle, lightly printed, faintly bureaucratic, designed not to thrill you, but to solve a problem you didn't know you had until you tried to mail a letter across borders in the age of ink. And if you're still awake by the time I start describing the personality of a postal clerk, mostly tired but correct, feel free to subscribe. Or don't. The coupon will remain, historically speaking, uninterested in applause that before the late 19th century, international mail could be a beautiful mess. Different postal systems had different rules. Postage rates varied. Methods of payment could be inconsistent, and what you could prepay in one place might not be easily recognized in another. You can already feel the headache forming, which is perfect for bedtime because the headache is purely administrative. If you wanted someone in another country to reply to you, you could include coins, but coins were bulky, suspicious, and sometimes not permitted. You could include stamps, but stamps only worked in the country that issued them, and most people did not keep a tasteful assortment of foreign stamps in their desk drawer, like a hobbyist who collects mild inconveniences. You could simply hope the other person would pay for the reply, which is socially risky because it turns your letter into a small financial request. "Hello, it's me. Also, please pay postage." That is not a romantic thing to ask. And it's not even a particularly dignified bureaucratic thing to ask. So the postal world, which runs on the quiet heroism of people agreeing to sort things correctly, eventually produced a calmer solution. In 1874, the Universal Postal Union was formed, a piece of peaceful international organization that sounds boring because it is boring, and because it works. The UPU helped standardize international mail practices and rates, and in that spirit of making the world less irritating, the International Reply Coupon was introduced later as a practical tool. The idea was gentle and simple. You buy a coupon in your country, you include it in a letter, and the recipient can exchange it in their own country for postage for a reply, usually equivalent to the minimum postage for an international letter. In other words, you sent someone portable prepaid reply potential, wrapped in official paper, like a quiet promise that said, your answer has already been socially funded. The coupon itself is wonderfully unglamorous. It's not a stamp. It's not money. It's a sort of paper key that can be exchanged for stamps. That layered system, the coupon becomes stamps. The stamps become a letter, feels like a dream invented by people who genuinely enjoy procedures. There's a soft elegance to it, though. It avoids the awkwardness of cash. It respects national stamp sovereignty. It gives everyone a shared mechanism. And it's the kind of mechanism that gradually becomes invisible, which is usually the sign that an invention has done its job. You don't think about a system when it works. You only think about it when it doesn't, and postal systems, like timekeeping systems, aim to spend their lives unnoticed. Using an international reply coupon also has a peculiar social tone. It's formal, but not stiff. It's considerate, but not dramatic. It's a small courtesy that says, I understand you live in a different system, and I would like to make this easy. In a way, it's a paper version of holding the door open. But it's also a tiny artifact of trust. You trust that the recipient will know what it is. You trust that their local post office will honor it. You trust that the coupon hasn't expired or become invalid due to rule changes that no one reads unless they have to. And you trust that the coupon won't be mistaken for something else and accidentally filed under mysterious paper. Probably not important, which is where many good intentions go to rest. If you want to keep your mind gently engaged, you can picture the real-world choreography. A person in one country writes a letter on good paper, perhaps with a mild seriousness. They go to the post office, buy an international reply coupon, and tuck it inside the envelope like a tiny folded favor. The letter travels. It arrives. The recipient opens it and finds, among the words, this extra piece of official paper. The recipient then has to do something wonderfully mundane, go to their own post office, hand the coupon to a clerk, and exchange it for stamps. The clerk examines it. The clerk knows what it is, or pretends to know what it is, which is often enough. The clerk provides stamps with a face that suggests this is either a routine act or an unusual act, depending on the clerk's day, and then the recipient uses those stamps to reply. An international conversation continues, powered by a small rectangle of standardized courtesy. The benefits are subtle but real. For scholars, collectors, people in correspondence networks, and anyone conducting business or personal relationships across borders, replying becomes less of a financial and logistical problem. The sender essentially removes a barrier. That barrier might be small, just the cost of postage, but barriers in communication often don't need to be huge to matter. A little inconvenience can become an excuse. I meant to write back, but is a phrase built on small frictions. The coupon smooths friction. It doesn't guarantee a reply, because nothing guarantees a reply, but it makes the excuse less comfortable. And there is also something quietly amusing about that, bureaucracy being used as a way to encourage human connection. The coupon also becomes a collectible object, which feels inevitable because humans will collect anything that has labels and rules. There are different designs, different languages printed on them, different versions over time. Paper ages, ink tones shift. Some coupons look crisp and official. Others look like they have been carried in pockets alongside loose buttons and the faint memory of a train ticket. And because they're associated with letters, they carry a secondary nostalgia, the nostalgia of correspondence itself. Letters are slow. They require patience. They require commitment. They require you to accept that your words will travel without you, which is a very restful thought. In a world of instant messages, the idea of a letter and its coupon feels like a sleepy creature from another era, blinking slowly. There is also, quietly, an economic dimension that is still boring enough to be soothing. Postal administrations have to price and redeem these coupons. Exchange rates matter. The value of stamps shifts. Policies get updated. Sometimes the coupon's value and stamps can change. Sometimes the coupon becomes less used. Sometimes the whole system gets adjusted because global mailing habits change. This is the part of the story where you can imagine committees meeting in rooms with very neutral furniture, discussing international reply instruments in a tone that never rises above a gentle murmur. In those rooms, the goal is not romance. The goal is to keep mail moving. What makes the international reply coupon especially sleepy is that it's a solution to a problem that only appears when the world gets connected in a certain way. It's a sign of global coordination, but not the dramatic kind. No flags, no treaties anyone reads at bedtime. Just the slow emergence of shared standards that let ordinary acts like asking someone a question and hoping for an answer happen across borders without annoying both parties. It's the kind of globalization that arrives as stationary. It's the kind of cooperation that doesn't demand you feel inspired. It just demands that you line up at a counter and fill out your envelope properly. If you let your thoughts drift further, you can notice how the coupon also reveals something about the nature of communication. For a letter to be answered, there must be willingness, time, and a path. Often we assume willingness is the main thing, but sometimes the path matters too. A small inconvenience can become a silent gate. The coupon is a key for a small gate. It says, I thought about this. And thinking about the other person's inconvenience is, in its quiet way, an act of kindness. It's also an act of engineering because kindness without a practical mechanism can just become sentiment. The coupon turns sentiment into stamps. There is another lightly humorous angle, too. The coupon is essentially a way to prepay a future activity in a different country through an intermediary agency using a standardized exchange object. If that sounds like a primitive version of a digital token, it's because it kind of is, except it's made of paper. And it is endorsed by postal unions rather than by a tech startup with a logo that looks like a geometric fruit. The coupon says, this token can be redeemed for services, and the service is a stamp. It's the quietest possible form of technology, a piece of paper with an agreed-upon meaning. Humans have been doing that for a long time. We just give it different names when it's new. Over the decades, as communication changes, the coupon becomes less visible in daily life. People rely on other methods. International mail shifts. Email happens. Messaging happens. The letter becomes more special rather than routine. The coupon, too, shifts from everyday tool to niche item. But even that decline is soothing. Not everything needs to stay central. Many useful inventions have their moment and then become footnotes, and footnotes are calm places to live. The coupon remains, historically, as a reminder that at one point the world was quietly optimizing the act of replying, and it did so with a simple object that traveled inside envelopes. So you can let the image settle. A small rectangle tucked into a letter, crossing borders without fanfare, carrying inside it a modest promise of return. Somewhere, a person opens an envelope and finds it. Somewhere, a clerk takes it and exchanges it for stamps with a practiced motion. Somewhere, another letter begins its journey back. And none of it is urgent. None of it needs you to stay awake. It's just a slow, cooperative chain of small actions, made smoother by standardization, made human by the fact that people still wanted replies in an era when replies took time. If you feel your attention thinning, you can let it thin. The coupon does not require your focus. It would be perfectly happy to remain a faint detail at the edge of your mind, like the sound of paper turning in a quiet room, while the rest of the world continues its slow work of agreeing on the smallest things, so that bigger things can remain, for a moment, at peace. You might not expect grief to come with a measurement system, a stationary budget, and a quietly official-looking border thickness. But in Victorian Britain, mourning often arrived not only as a feeling, but as a set of paper rules you could fold, seal, and send through the post with a straight face. If you're listening from somewhere still, you can picture an envelope on a small table, the lamp low, the room behaving, and the envelope looking almost ordinary except for one detail, a black line around the edge, like the page is wearing a modest frame. And if you're still awake by the time I start talking about how wide that frame was allowed to be, feel free to subscribe. Or don't. Morning stationery, historically speaking, never demanded enthusiasm, and it tended to prefer quiet compliance over loud admiration. The basic idea was simple enough to be dangerously expandable. When someone died, you informed people. You also, in many circles, signaled that you were in mourning so others would know how to behave around you, what to say, what not to say, what kind of invitations to avoid sending, and how many emotional exclamation points to remove from the conversation. Clothing did some of that signaling: black dresses, crepe, subdued jewelry, but letters did it too, because letters were the nervous system of social life. Victorian people wrote constantly, and they cared intensely about what writing looked like. So the morning letter became a physical object with a clear message before the words even began. The border said, gently and efficiently, please lower the volume of your expectations. The black border, in its most recognizable form, surrounded the paper like a quiet fence. It could appear on the notepaper, the envelope, and sometimes both, because if you're going to signal, you might as well signal with redundancy, and it wasn't always just a single thin line. For close mourning, the border might be thick sometimes, startlingly thick, so the page looked as though it had been dipped in seriousness. Over time, as weeks and months passed, the border might thin, fading in width the way a bruise fades in color. This is where grief becomes almost administrative. Your feelings might still be complicated, but the paper could at least tell everyone where you were in the schedule. It's a bit like a modern status indicator, except made of ink instead of a green dot. Available, but gently sad, says the thin border. Do not send party invitations, says the thick one. There were, of course, guides. Victorian life loved a guide. Etiquette manuals, letter-writing books, and household advice all offered suggestions for proper mourning behavior, including how long one should mourn, what one should wear, and how one should communicate. The specifics could vary by class, by region, by religion, and by the sheer creative stubbornness of individual families. But there was a general sense that mourning had stages. Widows' weeds could be strict and prolonged. Other relationships had shorter periods. And even if people didn't follow every rule perfectly, the existence of the rules created a shared language. The black border was part of that language, like punctuation with social consequences. And because the Victorians were Victorians, they didn't stop at one variable. It wasn't only border width. Paper texture mattered. The quality of the stationery mattered. The ink could matter. the seal could matter. Black wax seals were popular, and sometimes the seal itself carried symbolism initials, family crests, small emblems pressed into soft wax with a stamp that felt satisfying to use, the way any small ritual tool feels satisfying. Some people used edged cards for brief notes, and some used entire sets of mourning stationery, purchased in packets like a very somber subscription box. Stationers sold it because there was demand, and there was demand because grief and social performance lived in the same house. The postal system, which is always quietly present in these stories, also became part of the theater. Imagine being a Victorian postal clerk and noticing the edges. Letter after letter arrives in the sorting office, and you begin to recognize. Morning mail at a glance, because black borders stand out in a sea of cream envelopes. In a way, the border let grief travel. It transformed private loss into a public signal that moved through the country's ordinary mechanisms. Trains, sacks, sorting tables, delivery rounds. A morning letter could cross town or cross counties, or arrive at a distant cousin's house days later, still carrying that visual instruction, be gentle. There is something oddly comforting about the idea that paper could ask for kindness in advance. The first letter after a death often had a particular function. It wasn't just news. It was also an opening of a new social chapter. The writer might inform friends and relatives, share funeral details, and set the tone for the household. The recipient, seeing the border, would already understand that the reply should be subdued. That is one of the practical advantages of these signals. They reduce the chance of accidental cheerfulness. Nobody wants to respond to a death notice with the verbal equivalent of confetti. The border helps prevent that. It's like putting a quiet hour sign on the conversation dot at the same time. The system had its softly absurd side. Not everyone had the time or money to perfectly match paper to grief. Some people improvised. Some used whatever stationery they already had and added black edging by hand, which is an image that is both tender and slightly funny. Someone with a ruler and ink, carefully drawing a border around a letter because social codes were powerful, and also because they wanted the recipient to understand the gravity. Sometimes you can almost feel the person's concentration, the slight tremble of the line, the attempt to make it neat. A perfectly straight morning border is hard when your hands are exhausted. The Victorians, for all their rules, were still humans trying to manage their days. There was also the matter of timing, because mourning did not only have intensity, it had duration. Etiquette culture suggested lengths of full mourning and half mourning, which could involve shifting from deep black to gray or lavender tones in clothing, and sometimes lighter borders in paper. This is where grief becomes seasonal in a strange way. Imagine reaching a date on the calendar and deciding your border can narrow now. It sounds cold if you say it quickly, but if you say it the Victorian way slowly, as a ritual it becomes a method of surviving. The rules create a path through time, and paths are comforting when you don't know what to do with your days. Stationery itself was a powerful Victorian obsession even without death. Paper quality was a marker of respectability. Handwriting was a marker of character. The style of address, the choice of paper size, the fold, the seal, and the spacing of lines all communicated something. When mourning entered that world, it didn't replace the obsession, it simply gave it darker clothing. The letter became a quiet piece of performance art, restrained, tasteful, correct. And correctness mattered because correctness was a way to keep chaos from spilling. In the middle of loss, you could still be correct about envelopes. That might sound trivial, but trivia is sometimes what keeps people upright. If you want a soft, modern analogy, think of mourning stationery as the Victorian equivalent of switching your phone to silent and turning on a muted theme, except it was done in public and on paper. It told everyone, without words, that you were not in a bright, chatty mode. It created friction for social demands. A person receiving your letter might hesitate before asking you to attend something, or might choose their words more carefully, or might simply understand that your household had entered a quieter phase. The border was a boundary. It didn't stop communication. It adjusted the temperature of it. The border also traveled into business life. This is one of the quietly odd things. Grief did not pause commerce, and commerce did not always pause grief. Businesses sometimes sent notices on morning paper if a principal died, or if a firm was informing clients of a death. That means there are letters that combine very practical content with a funereal border, like, "We regret to inform you of Mr. Smith's passing, and also your account will now be handled by..." It's not heartless. It's simply life continuing with paperwork. Victorian culture was exceptionally good at blending emotion and administration into the same envelope. And then there's the deeper layer, the one that makes this topic both boring and strangely hypnotic. The border is not grief itself. It is a symbol of grief. It can be sincere and it can also be performative, and sometimes it can be both at once. People used it to communicate loss, but also to demonstrate that they knew how to mourn properly. Social interpretation is always lurking. A thick border might be read as devotion. A too thin border might be read as indifference. No border could be seen as a breach, unless context excused it. It's exhausting when you think about it to have your emotional state evaluated by stationary design. But it's also very human. Humans look for signals. Humans interpret signals. And when signals become standardized, they become easy to read, which is the point. The market responded because markets always do. Stationers stocked mourning sets. Printers produced edged paper in different thicknesses. Some even offered custom crusts or monograms in black. There were mourning cards and memorial cards. Small printed objects that could be handed out or kept, sometimes with verses or names and dates. These objects have survived in drawers and archives, and when you see them now, they feel like artifacts of a time when people believed deeply that the correct way to hold pain was to shape it into something orderly. A border is order. A border says, this is contained. Even if inside it isn't taut, it's also worth noticing how the border made the paper look smaller. A thick black line eats into the white space, leaving less room for words, which is a quiet visual metaphor. Grief squeezes the available space for ordinary life. The Victorians probably didn't need the metaphor explained. They lived it. They wrote within the frame. They read around the loss. Sometimes the letters are short because people didn't know what to say. Sometimes they are long because people needed to say everything. Either way, the border sat there, silent, framing the human attempt to behave. Sometimes the border even traveled into the familiar domestic habit of saving letters. Families kept correspondence, tied in bundles, stored in boxes. Mourning letters could be filed alongside ordinary letters, but they would stand out, making small dark rectangles in the stack, like visual timestamps of difficult years. In a way, the border made memory physical. You could open a box and see immediately where the household passed through loss. It's a soft kind of time machine. You don't need to read the words to feel the mood, asterisk. And gradually, as the 20th century arrives and social customs shift, the practice becomes less central. People continue to mark mourning in different ways, but the strictness loosens, the borders appear less often, the etiquette becomes less mandatory, and communication changes shape. Telephone calls arrive. Later, faster technologies arrive. The letters roll changes. Yet the old practice still lingers in a sleepy corner of material culture, because there is something strangely soothing about the idea of grief being given a simple visual form. A border is quiet. A border doesn't argue. A border doesn't over-explain. It simply says, this letter is not an ordinary letter, and that's sometimes all you need. If your mind is starting to drift, you can keep only a few gentle images. A stationer's shop with drawers of paper, some edged, some plain. A clerk laying out a set of envelopes with black frames like small, respectful windows. A person sitting at a desk, hands slow, writing carefully because the act of writing is easier than the act of feeling. An envelope sealed, addressed, and sent. Another person opening it, seeing the border, and instinctively lowering their voice inside their own head. These are small scenes, and they don't build to a dramatic resolution. They don't need to. You can also let the border become a kind of soft symbol for the whole idea of bedtime history. The frame around the facts. Facts tell you what happened. The frame tells you how to hold it. The Victorians framed their loss with ink. We can frame our attention with calm. And as the night continues, you don't have to hold on to the details of etiquette manuals or the exact thickness of lines. You can just let the notion settle that once, in a world of trains and letters and careful social behavior, people invented a quiet way to warn the world that their household was tender. And they did it with a simple black edge that could travel through the post and arrive before the words even began. And then, like a room going still after the lamp is turned down, the rest can fade gently, the paper can fold, the ink can dry, and your thoughts can drift inside their own soft border, becoming quieter, thinner, lighter, until there's almost nothing left to track at all.